4. City of the Prophet. Mecca, impudently renouncing the conventions of sanctuary, grew alien and menacing to Muhammad and his community in the early 620s. The Spoils 830 addresses him, recall when the pagans were intriguing against you, to kidnap you, or murder you, or to expel you, and they were plotting, and God was plotting, and God is the best conspirator. The precarious condition in which the believers and their leader found themselves may have reflected in part geopolitical developments. Khosrow II had by 619 taken the entire Near East, including Egypt, from Heraclius, dramatically worsening the strategic situation for Muhammad and his pro-Roman community. Iranian power flowed all around Mecca, save across the Red Sea in Ethiopia. If the Hejaz pagans allied with Iran, they may have been emboldened by this foreign support in their struggle against Muhammad and his believers. In the late spring of 622, later sources allege, a group of Medians met furtively with Muhammad at a Kaaba outside Mecca, pledging their fealty to him. They vowed that they would stick with Muhammad in good times and bad, and that we would not wrong anyone, that we would speak the truth at all times, and that in God's service we would fear the censure of none. 1. It probably cannot be called a conversion in the modern individual and psychological sense, but many among the Banu Khazraj back in Medina are said to have joined Muhammad's believers after this pledge, under the influence of the clan chiefs. This movement may have been spearheaded by the Banu Najjar of the Khazraj tribe, Muhammad's relatives through his great-grandmother, who inducted him as a ceremonial official of the clan. Such crowd conversions, however sincere, were not an informed choice of individual conscience. People often migrated en masse into a new religious identity in late antiquity, and we have stories of throngs of pagans collectively joining Christian churches because, for instance, a bishop managed to summon rain to end a drought. 2. Actually growing into the faith and internalizing its values took time thereafter. The Khazraj who invited Muhammad had ties with the Banu Ghassan, who had been federates of Constantinople. It has been suggested that they may have been searching for pro-Roman allies in the darkest days of the Iranian occupation, and just as Heraclius began his major 622 counterthrust in Asia Minor. They may have been especially desperate during this period of Sasanian triumph, when, it appears, even many Christian Arabs had defected to Iran, angered by Chalcedonian intolerance of their Miaphysite creed and tempted by the relative tolerance of the Iranians. Pro-Sasanian Arab auxiliaries, a battalion of long-haired Saracens, came up from Syria to attack the army of Heraclius in that year. 3. Muhammad began encouraging his small Meccan community to slip away to Medina. Ibn Hisham says that when they found out about the migration, some Meccan pagans tried to stop believers from leaving by kidnapping them, and would especially insist that the women in the household stay. According to a letter of where Ibn al-Zubayr, after most of Muhammad's followers emigrated to Medina, Abu Bakr asked the Prophet for permission to leave with his associates. 4. Muhammad replied, "Give me some time. I do not know, perhaps I will be permitted to depart." Abu Bakr in the meantime prepared 2 steeds for a quick escape if the time came. Where said Aisha told him that one day Muhammad came to the house of her father, Abu Bakr, at noon when she and her sister Asma were there, rather than, according to his habit, in the morning or evening. On that day in 622, Abu Bakr knew something was afoot. The Prophet said, "God has given me permission to emigrate to Medina." Abu Bakr asked, "Messenger of God, in the company of someone?" "Yes," the Prophet replied. "Take one of the riding camels," Abu Bakr said. The two went secretly to a place nearby called Thor and hid in one of the area's inky caves overhung by jagged slabs of pink cast limestone. In the evenings a freedman of Abu Bakr, Amr ibn Fuhaira, under the guise of shepherding, brought him simple provisions. They hired a pagan, Abdullah ibn Arkad, as a guide over the backways to Medina. Once again, the late Muslim sources say that the messenger trusted and owed his life to a devotee of the old gods. Muhammad received reassurances and a gift of spiritual peace at this perilous moment. Repentance 940 recalled these events. The pagans drove him away, the second of 2, when both were in the cave. He said to his companion, "Do not sorrow, surely God is with us." Then God sent down on him his peace, Sakina, and confirmed him with invisible hosts, and he made the word of the unbelievers the most abject, and God's word is most exalted. God is almighty, all-wise. The Arabic Sakina derives from the Hebrew Shekinah, indicating God's presence in the world and the calm of the soul that it bestows. The term came into Arabic and English from rabbinic literature. It does not occur in the Bible. 5. Both in Hebrew and in Arabic its root has to do with dwelling, though it also bears the connotation of stillness. In the Quran it connotes self-control and inner peace in the face of aggression, and a commitment to establishing peace as the end state. The Bible tells the story of how Solomon brought the Ark of the Covenant, the ornate gold-plated chest containing the tablets inscribed with the 10 Commandments, to the temple in Jerusalem. He had it deposited there before the city's masses when the glory of the Lord filled the temple. Later commentators identified this glory with the Shekinah, 1 Kings 8.6. After the Romans burned the Second Temple in 70 CE, the sage Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha, 90-135 CE, said, "Whithersoever Israel was exiled, the Shekinah, as it were, went into exile with them." 7. In deploying the Arabic equivalent, Sakina, in connection with the emigration, the Quran may make an analogy between Muhammad's exile from Mecca to Medina and the diaspora of the children of Israel. Just as the Romans had barred the Jews from the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and forced some of them abroad, so Abu Jahl and Abu Sufyan had banished Muhammad and the believers from the shrine of the Lord in Mecca. One version of Urwa's narrative says that the irate Meccan leadership, not satisfied to have expelled the Prophet, placed a bounty of 100 camels on Muhammad's head, turning him into a fugitive wanted dead or alive. 8. When the frenzy caused in Mecca by the disappearance had died down, Muhammad and Abu Bakr called the pagan camel driver, who brought the steeds. 9. They set off on the darkling path. Riding camels can travel about 80 miles a day, so this journey of 280 miles would have taken 4 days or so. They followed a circuitous nocturnal route like a salamander's tail down to the humid Red Sea coast and back up toward Medina to their northeast, guided by hilltop marker cairns silhouetted against the buck moon. They would have ridden uncertainly through the desert gloom, fed the dromedaries from the spiny leaves of hardy tamarisk trees, and avoided palm hut villages where the barking of shepherd dogs might have alerted people to the passage. The guide, Abdullah ibn Arkad, knew where the out-of-the-way wells lay, essential despite the brackishness of the stale water, and which ones were not infested with snakes. They would have tried to catch some sleep in the shade of serrated flintstone outcroppings in the sizzling Hajaz mornings. All the while, they had to assume that Meccan search parties were close on their heels, attempting to discover and summarily execute them. Reddish-black lava hillsides brooded over Medina, an emerald oasis of date orchards and farms dotted with tribal hamlets among which stood imposing tower houses and defensive redoubts. Muhammad, on arriving, stayed with supporters in Upper Medina, while he had his own mansion built, as well as a place of prayer, in the more central Lower Medina. The Prophet created a sanctuary in his adopted city where hunting, cutting down trees, and carrying weapons were forbidden, suggesting that he intended to turn it into a site of sacred peace and, likely, of expanded trade. Later traditionists attributed to him the saying, "Mecca was Abraham's sanctuary and Medina is mine." 10. Later Muslims saw the emigration, Hijra, as a pivotal event in the history of Muhammad's religion and began the calendar with the year 622, so that subsequent dates are given according to the lunar year as after Hijra are. The earliest surviving document with such a date, a bilingual papyrus in Greek and Arabic, comes from R22. The idea of emigrating for the cause of God became central to the faith. 11. A historian of the city wrote some 200 years later. When the Prophet, may the peace and blessings of God be upon him, came to Medina, it had a mixed population. Some were Muslims who had been gathered together by the messenger's preaching, and some were polytheists who worshipped idols, and some were Jews who possessed weaponry and fortresses. The latter were allies of the Aus and the Khazraj. The messenger of God, on his arrival, wanted to reconcile them and make peace among them. At that time, one man might be a Muslim and his father or his brother a polytheist. When Muhammad came to Medina, the polytheists and Jews used to severely persecute him and his companions. 12. Medina had had a turbulent political history. Later Arab legends say many of its Jews were expelled in the 6th century, but that the minority who remained retained ownership and control of some important towers, blockhouses, and weapons stockpiles. In the middle of the 500s, the Christian ruler of Himyar in Yemen, Abra, claimed in an inscription to have subjected Yathrib and much of Arabia, and another inscription suggests he made a follow-up foray around 567, in the year of the elephant when Muhammad was born. Then in the 570s a wave of Sasanian rule and influence washed over Arabia, as Yemen fell to an Iranian admiral. The dominant Khazraj and Yathrib became indirect vassals of Sasanian Iran. By the early 600s, in turn, Iran's influence waned north of Yemen, leaving Medians to make their own political arrangements. 13. The Medians had proved not to be very good at self-rule. In the first 2 decades of the 7th century, the two major tribes, the Aus and the Khazraj, pursued violent feuding in the city over scarce cultivable land and over springs and aquifers for irrigation. They fought several major urban battles with one another, including, around 617, the Battle of Bu-at. This conflict pitted the Aus and 2 small Jewish clans against the Khazraj, who were supported by a third Jewish group. The Khazraj had come out on top in previous such struggles, but this time they suffered defeat. This rout may have made some Khazraj more open to the message of Muhammad. In addition, they may have been primed to hear the message of Muhammad in part by the greater familiarity with biblical themes through local Jews and Christians and by the literacy of some of them in Aramaic or its Eastern dialect, Syriac. 14. In the new city, Muhammad sought harmony within his blossoming religious community. The Cow 208 instructs the believers in this era, you who have believed, enter into peace altogether. Do not follow in the footsteps of Satan, for he is an open enemy. 15. The Quran later praised the partnership of Muhammad's followers among both displaced Meccans and local Medians. The latter became known as helpers, the initial vanguard among the emigrants and the helpers, and those who followed him in doing good. God will be well pleased with them and they are well pleased with him. He has prepared for them gardens underneath which rivers flow, therein to dwell forever and ever. That is a magnificent victory. Repentance 9:100. Later writers maintained that Muhammad gained converts from among pagans and Jews in his new city. For instance, Ibn Hisham alleges that Rabbi Abdullah ibn Salam said, "When I heard about the messenger I knew by his description, name, and the time at which he appeared that he was the one we were waiting for, and I rejoiced greatly, though I kept silent about it until the messenger came to Medina. When he stayed in Kuba among the Banu Amr ibn Awf, a man came with the news while I was working at the top of a palm tree. He asserted that his aunt Khalida, sitting below, heard him crying out to God. She exclaimed, 'Good gracious, if you had heard that Moses ben Amram had come back you could not have made more fuss.' 'Indeed, my aunt,' he said, 'he is the brother of Moses and follows his religion, being sent with the same mission.' 16. These hagiographical stories of conversions have to be taken with a grain of salt. We know, however, that Jewish millenarian movements arose in this era in Jerusalem and Baluta, and that some in that community saw Muhammad as the Messiah seems plausible. Subsequent Muslim biographers insisted that the Medinan believers comprised many groups, including a Jewish convert faction, such as the wealthy and formidable Rabbi Makairig, who distinguished themselves on the battlefield against belligerent Meccan pagans. 17. What the later Muslim historical tradition says of Medina makes it sound very much like a late 4th century Roman city, as though it were 20 decades behind the times. Its pagans maintained a Tychian temple to the goddess of fate, its Jews served as prominent civic leaders, and its Christians were in the minority. Likely many non-Jews joined in the fall commemorations of the high holy days, including the Jewish New Year and the Day of Atonement marked by the blowing of the ram's horn or shofar, extra recitations of the Psalms, and fasting. Some Medinan Christians and Jews, according to the Quran, also joined in pagan festivals and worship. Have you not seen those given a portion of the scripture believing in Jit and Taggart, who say to the pagans that they are better guided to the path than the believers? The Women 451.18. The Quran's description of Medinan society, which originates in the 620s, differs significantly from that of the Prophet's later biographers who lived in the era of the Abbasid Caliphate, 750-1258. The scripture speaks of 6 communities there: Jews, Christians, pagans, those called Sabians, the believers, and the hypocrites, or inconstant followers of Muhammad. The Prophet did not become the ruler of Medina but rather functioned as a holy man or senator among the diverse clan chiefs who ruled by consensus, aiming to mediate conflicts both inside his own community and outside. Since Christians bulk so large in the Medinan chapters, and are depicted as engaging in polemics with Jews, the Quran is telling us of a Christian neighborhood in the city. We now know there were also Hijazi Christian monasteries far north of Medina. 19. The later biographers, living in societies where Muslim rulers heavily depended on Christian allies, largely erased these Medinan Christians, so clearly linked by the Quran, from history, possibly because Medinan Christians were not always favorable to the messenger. Miaphysite Arab tribes, no less than Jewish burghers, often declared for Sasanian Iran in this era. Muhammad, in addition, perhaps led some caravans up to Bostra or Damascus in the early 620s, so that some of these debates occurred at his summer mansion there. Theologians have identified the possible stances on the salvation of members of other traditions as exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism. 20. Exclusivists hold that only members of their own religion are saved. Inclusivists say that the tradition has the whole truth, but others may have a portion of it. Pluralism is the position that various faiths offer equally valid paths to paradise. The declining population of pagans of late antiquity sometimes espoused this latter view, arguing, with no success, to Christians that no one spiritual path could hope to encompass God, given his ineffability. 21. Muhammad taught a form of salvific pluralism that included all the monotheist traditions but excluded the hostile North Arabian pagans, and he deployed this ecumenism in a bid to unite much of the city behind him. Ecumenism does not imply a surrender on matters of doctrine but rather implies a willingness to dialogue and coexist. Indeed, on matters of doctrine the Quran takes instead an inclusivist position, that it has the full truth but that members of the previous rites had forgotten or distorted some of what had been revealed to them. Later authors wrote that not everyone in Medina, still a diverse city, rushed to embrace Muhammad's new faith. Now some of the sheikhs still kept to their old paganism, among whom was Amr ibn al-Jamu. Amr was one of the tribal nobles and leaders and had set up in his house a wooden idol called Manat as the nobles used to do, reverencing it as a god and keeping it clean. 22. Amr was not alone. Nabtal al-Harith, a sturdy black man with long flowing hair, inflamed eyes and ruddy black cheeks, used to come and talk to the Prophet and listen to him and then carry what he had said to the hypocrites. He observed, Muhammad will listen to anyone, and gullibly falls for the stories. 23. Muhammad yielded nothing to the polytheists theologically, even as he sought cordial social relations with them. The family of Amram 385 remonstrates with them, whoever follows a religion other than the monotheistic tradition, Islam, it shall not be accepted, and that one will be among the losers in the hereafter. Again, in the Quran Islam denotes general monotheism of the Abrahamic sort, not the specific religion of Muhammad. Nevertheless, the Prophet showed willingness to seek political arrangements with friendly traditionalists. Some of the Khazraj tribe also remained pagans, worshipping local cult gods, and for others the conversion was superficial or they came to regret it. Abdullah ibn Ubay led a faction of Khazraj in Medina. A local notable, he had been on the verge of being recognized as the leader of his tribe when the rest of the city made its arrangement with Muhammad, forestalling his ambitions and creating some hard feelings. 24. He is alleged to have led a faction of lukewarm believers known as hypocrites, who felt it was legitimate to have differences of opinion with Muhammad. The Prophet also faced difficulties from another group. The clans that had been known earlier in Medinan history as Osmanad did not convert until 627, 5 years later. A medieval historian wrote of Abu Qays ibn al-Aslat, a poet and leader of this section of the Ors, he did not accept Islam until after the Battle of the Trench. Likewise delayed in the belief were the Katma clan of Banu Jusham ibn Malik bin Ors, and the assemblage of the Waqif clan, and the Ors Allah, drawn from those clans, from the children of Murrah ibn Malik ibn al-Ors. 25. Before Muhammad's emigration, the Ors Manat clans changed their name and became known as Ors Allah, trading the goddess of fate for the all-high god. The sources say Abu Qays ibn al-Aslat had investigated Judaism but declined to adopt it. Then he spent some time in Damascus and discussed Christianity with monks, but did not embrace it. He returned and declared himself an Abrahamian, declining to worship any deity but God or to eat any flesh that had been sacrificed to other gods. He purportedly acted as a peacemaker after the Battle of at between Aws and Khazraj. Later authors blame him for the refusal of Aws Allah to join Muhammad's movement. Another Aws Allah figure, Abu Amr of the clan of Dubay had also been an important leader in Medina before the Prophet's advent. A Hanif, or pagan monotheist, he experimented briefly with asceticism, which may explain his sobriquet, the monk. Some say he came into conflict with Muhammad soon after the emigration of 622 concerning Gentile monotheism and the legacy of Abraham, accusing him of not practicing it correctly. 26. Abu Amr the monk is said to have come to Muhammad to inquire about his beliefs. Muhammad replied, the Hanafiya, the religion of Abraham. Abu Amr said, that is what I follow. You do not. But I do. You, Muhammad, have introduced into the Hanafiya things that do not belong to it. I have not. I have brought it pure and white. Abu Amr exploded, may God let the liar die a lonely, homeless, fugitive. Well and good, may God so reward him. We can conclude that some Aws had moved toward a form of pagan monotheism since tradition remembered that both of the Hanif figures in Medina hailed from Aws and that one of them led the clans making up Aws Allah. Both leaders allegedly spent time in Damascus, where a God-fearing cult may have survived and attracted Arab converts. In the Medina period of the 620s, the Quran abruptly begins speaking of a major monotheistic religious group, the Sabians. The later Muslim chroniclers forgot who they were. Some scholars, however, have recently derived Sabian from the Greek root for God-fearers, that is pagan monotheists. 27. If the Aws had already conducted a monotheistic reform of the cult, Muhammad's new faith might have been less appealing to them. Since God-fearers typically were influenced by the Bible, and they may have had a lectionary from Damascus of Greek and Aramaic hymns, the Quran possibly includes them when it speaks of the scriptural communities, or, literally, the people of the book. There is evidence that associates of Abu Amr the monk who were less hot-headed than he and who remained in Medina established a Sabian temple in the city, which the Quran later denounced for its hostility to the Prophet and urged the believers to avoid. 28. Abu Amr and some of his Aws clansmen fell out so vehemently with Muhammad that at some point, the biographers say, they engaged in a reverse emigration. This band headed off to Mecca, where they allied with the Quraysh pagans against him and, ominously, prepared to launch an invasion of Medina. In the early 620s, Muhammad engaged in treaty negotiations with clan heads to forge a social contract among the Quraysh emigrants, 8 clans of the helpers, Jewish clients of the latter, and what was likely a Christian tribe. The talks resulted in a renowned document, the Constitution of Medina, the surviving text of which scholars widely view as authentic. 29. Both full believers and mere submitters are parties to the Constitution. All the signatories would stand together, Muhammad hoped, against the onslaughts of the militant Quraysh. The contracting parties undertake to help one another against any attack on Yathrib. The text prohibits polytheist signatories from friendly relations with the traditionalists in Mecca. 30. Some members of the contracting clans were therefore still pagans, while others may have been Christians, so that this constitution involved at least some members of all the major groups in the city, save the Aws Allah. Any internal controversy that arose had to be referred for resolution to Muhammad, the arbiter of disputes. The constitution provided for a kind of clan federalism in the city of Medina. It made the Khazraj and Aws responsible for paying blood money at the clan level when a member committed a tort. The Quraysh emigrants remained liable for paying the wergild if one of their number injured or killed someone, as well as for ransoming any who were taken captive. This clause suggests that the Medians did not want to become responsible for the ransom when the militant Meccans kidnapped emigrants, as they strove to do. The document also forbids Quraysh emigrants from siding with an outside clan against other believers. The Jewish signatories would not be wronged, would be treated with equality, and would be given help. The believers would not ally with their enemies. Jews who fought alongside the believers were to contribute to defraying the cost of war. The Jews allied with the Khazraj and Aws clans, and any clients of these Jews, are one nation with the believers. The Jews have their religion and the believers have theirs. This phrase demonstrates that Muhammad was continuing with his project of an ecumenical believers movement, in which other monotheists could retain their own rituals, beliefs, and practices. These provisions granted the named Jewish clans protection of the law and religious tolerance. 31. Jewish parties to the compact pledged, each must help the other against anyone who makes war on the people of this document. Later histories say many Jews retained their own faith, as the constitution allowed. Ibn Hisham reports that Abu Salibah al-Fituni said to him, Muhammad, you have not brought us anything we recognize, and God has not sent down to you any sign that we should follow you. Zayd ibn al-Lusayt, from the Jewish Kanoka clan, observed when the prophet's steed wandered off at one point, Muhammad alleges that revelations come to him from heaven, but he doesn't know where his camel is. Muhammad replied, I only know what God lets me know. 32. Muhammad's constitution appears to recognize at least one Christian group as a signatory, the Jaffna clan of Banu Tar-Labba. The Tar-Labba also had Jewish members who signed on to this treaty. Up until the rupture of the 580s, the Jaffnids had provided the Falach of the Christian Arabs for the Romans in central and eastern Syria. 33. The treaty proclaimed that these diverse groups had become one nation by virtue of the defensive alliance with Muhammad against militant Mecca. In late antiquity, words for nation and ethnicity were also commonly applied to religious groupings, including to Christians, who were sometimes called a third race between pagans and Jews. Muhammad was building two nations, a narrow one comprising full-fledged believers and submitters, and a broad, ecumenical one that grouped the latter with friendly allies from among the other monotheists. Muhammad likely conceived of the second as a nation of Abrahamians. Like Paul, the Quran views Abraham as a universal forebear and not the patriarch of Judaism alone. In Galatians 3:17, Paul observed that Abraham lived 430 years before Moses brought down the law. See also Rom. 4:9-11.34. The Quran, the Table 5:5, underlined the common Abrahamic ethnicity by allowing believers to intermarry with Jews and Christians and to share meals with them. Modern sociologists often demarcate ethnic groups on the basis that they practice endogamy, preferring to marry other members of the same group. In contrast, Christian Roman law forbade Jews from marrying Christians on pain of death, and Christian authorities criticized eating Jewish food as shameful and sacrilegious. Most rabbis were not enthusiastic about such social and marital mixing either. Christian law helped create the endogamous Christian race, or nation, whereas the law of the Quran creates a rainbow race of Abrahamians. 35. The constitution of Medina differs entirely from the norms of the 7th century Christian Roman Empire. It offers a vision of a non-doctrinal, religiously multicultural society, nation, based on social loyalty, granting of security, and tribal mechanisms for settling torts. It established obligations of non-belligerence in the city of the Prophet. These policies clearly aimed at finding a basis for solidarity in the face of a building Meccan assault. Even as Muhammad was cobbling together a legal framework for multicultural politics in Medina, he had the continuing task of keeping his own growing community together. The Quran speaks of social tensions among the believers in Medina. The tradition remembered one of these conflicts as being between Khazraj and Aus converts, or helpers, who had pursued over decades a long-standing tribal feud. The Aus purportedly refused to worship behind a Khazraj prayer leader and vice versa, so an emigrant took up that duty. 36. Ibn Hisham tells an anecdote about the fervent pagan Shas ibn Qais, who worried that Muhammad's growing community would place him and his ilk at a disadvantage in Medina. 37. The biographer invites us to imagine the scene. Shas mischievously sent emissaries to a gathering of believers that included Aus and Khazraj with instructions to recite the poetry of Bu at battle days. Thereupon the people began to talk and to quarrel and to boast until two men of the two clans leapt up. Aus ibn Qais and Jabbar ibn Sak, noses flaring, began to taunt one another until one of them said, "If you want to fight, we can go again." At that point, the men of the other tribe replied, "We will. Look for us outside," that being the volcanic tract. In their febrile agitation, they prepared to brawl. Word reached Muhammad of the impending fracas, and he rushed urgently to the billowing guesthouse pavilion beside the basalt lava bed where they had gathered. Standing before the scowling tribesmen, face grey as lead, the prophet delivered an impassioned homily calling for unity. Perhaps it resembled a passage in the family of Amram 3:103, which instructs the believers, "Hold fast, all of you, to the cord of God, and do not divide into factions. Remember God's favor to you, inasmuch as you were enemies, but he united your hearts, so that by his blessing you became siblings. You were on the brink of a pit of fire, and he delivered you from it. In this way does God make clear his signs to you, so that you might be guided." Brought up short by what he said, they wept, and the men of the Aus and Khazraj embraced one another. Regardless of this story's veracity, the Quran certainly indicates that the Medinan community suffered fissures that the Prophet strove to repair. Later Muslims made the phrase, "united your hearts," a cornerstone of their political theology. As the composition became more diverse, maintaining the unity of the believers became more difficult, and Muhammad was increasingly preoccupied with this task. The Quran warns the believers against falling into sectarianism in the way that Jews and Christians had. Do not be like those who divided into sects and disputed, after clear verses came to them, for severe torment awaits them. 38. It appears that at one point, some believers strayed but then wanted to make amends and to pray with Muhammad's congregants in good standing. The Cattle 6:52 says of them, "Do not drive out those who call on their Lord morning and evening, seeking his countenance. It is not for you to bring them to account, nor can they bring you to account. Were you to expel them, you would be acting unjustly." Remarkably, the Quran forbids the messenger from excommunicating them or even from judging them as long as they prove repentant and mend their ways. The Cattle 6:54 instructed Muhammad with regard to these contrite believers, "When those who believe in our verses come to you, say, peace be upon you. God has prescribed for himself compassion. Whoever among you commits a sin out of ignorance, and then repents and makes restitution, God is forgiving, merciful." Precisely because so many in Medina had joined the new movement by acclamation, there were many levels of knowledge about and commitment to the faith among its adherents. To speak of the believers, or, more anachronistically, Muslims, in a monolithic way would go against everything we know about late antiquity. 39. The Chambers 49:14 distinguishes between full believers and those, still in the apprentice stage, who have merely submitted, or become monotheists Muslims. The latter, lacking intimate knowledge of the Prophet and the Quran, are analogous to the catechumens of Christianity awaiting baptism while they study its teachings, and it appears that Bedouin followers in particular fell into this category. Moreover, levels of commitment differed from person to person. One of the wages of the mixing of spirituality with political power is hypocrisy, which emerged as a problem in Medina just as it had in newly Christian-ruled Rome under Constantine 3 centuries before. The first Christian emperor's panegyrist, Eusebius, had complained of the scandalous hypocrisy of those who crept into the church, and assumed the name and character of Christians once it became lucrative to do so. 40. The Quran, the women 142, likewise complained of some in Medina. The hypocrites would deceive God, but he is the one who deceives them. They perform the prayer lazily, just to show off before the people. In truth, they seldom remember God. The existence within the community of an unreliable faction at a time when Mecca was preparing open warfare profoundly endangered the Prophet's mission. In October 623, a Meccan brave named Kurz ibn Jabr al-Fihri is alleged to have come up to the pastures around Medina with his men. At dawn they would have drunk off their morning draught of frothy wine, summoning the battle lust. They rode the chargers, fierce as leopards, down on Medina's unsuspecting flocks, rustling them. Muhammad and his men mounted up and pursued them to the vicinity of the wells of Badr, which lay between Medina and Mecca. Kurz and his cheeky band, however, eluded them. The believers' need for unity in the face of Meccan enmity remained urgent. 41. The Quran suggests that the Meccan pagans, in addition to raiding Medina's herds, range up toward the city in hopes of coming across individuals or small bands of the believers whom they could kidnap and return to Mecca, forcing them back into paganism. In August 623, after he had been in Medina for about a year, Muhammad, his future son-in-law Ali, and some of the emigrants went out of the city along an uneven hill path known to the Prophet's relatives, the Banu al-Najjar of the Khazraj tribe. They would have made their way through granite ridges down into glassy ebony ravines lined with dark volcanic sand and then descended into the Seir Fawn Kabar desert. They made camp beneath a lonely acacia tree, propping the cooking pots up on a circle of rocks, and brought water from the nearby Musharib spring. They prayed at dawn, still turning toward Iranian-occupied Jerusalem, though soon they would be instructed to pray instead toward Mecca, as Muhammad's religion declared its independence. At length they reached a place called Al-Abwa. There, Muhammad came across the pagan tribe Banu Damra ibn Bakr and succeeded in making a peace treaty with them. The believers returned to Medina, having avoided any violence with the surrounding pastoralists. 42. Later Muslim historians insisted on calling these exploratory journeys of the Prophet into the Medinan hinterland raids, but the first 6 they mention never involved fighting and seem instead to have been a search for rural allies. The Quran confirms that pagan tribes concluded political agreements with Muhammad. Some of them, it complained, later broke that treaty and went over to Mecca politically. The vilest of creatures in the sight of God are the pagans who do not believe, those with whom you made a compact, and who then on every occasion broke that covenant, and who are not God-fearing. The Spoils 855-56.43. Here, this group achieves the distinction of the worst among creatures not because they embraced paganism but because they committed treason, reneging on the alliance. During this same expedition, the Prophet is said to have dispatched another emigrant believer, one Ubaidah ibn al-Harith, with a few dozen men to a watering hole known as Arya. There they came upon a band of the Quraysh led by a son of the militant pagan and city notable Abu Jahl of Banu Makhzum, though they avoided a fight. 2 believers who were with the pagans managed to escape and come over to Ubaidah. The medieval historian Tabari says that these 2 had been sent by the Prophet to Mecca in an attempt to effect a reconciliation with its pagans, but they had been detained and now escaped to the side of the believers. The community faced the constant problem of how to deal with believers who had been abducted and then eluded the pagan captors. The B16-110 instructs forgiveness, assuming the lapsed individuals make personal sacrifices and come to Medina, your Lord, for those who emigrated after having been coerced out of their religion, and then struggled and were patient, your Lord in truth is after all that forgiving and compassionate. If the Constitution of Medina embodied Muhammad's political charter for peace and unity, the notion of the community of the saved, which encompasses upright members of all the monotheistic traditions, expressed his theological framework for municipal concord. Just as the Quran presents the next world as a society of peace and as a model for life on earth, likewise, in the Medina era, the Quran pledged joint entry into heaven to those communities, believers, Jews, Christians, and pagan monotheists, which served to knit them together politically. The Quran sees religious diversity as permitted by God's will. If your Lord had desired, he would have made the people one nation, but they continue to differ. Hud 11, 118.44. The Quran says that followers of the monotheistic religions all fall into the category of the potentially saved. The Cow 2:62 proclaims, those who believe, and the Jews, and the Christians, and the Sabians, and whoever has believed in God and the last day and performed good works, they shall have their reward with their Lord. These verses are clearly talking about Jews, Christians, and Sabians who remained in their faiths and did not convert, as some early Muslim exegetes recognized. The followers of Muhammad are mentioned separately as those who believe. The requirements for salvation that it specifies, including acceptance of the resurrection of the dead and the judgment day, were the same basic doctrines that Emperor Justinian had laid out as an obligation upon the Jews of the Roman Empire. 45. The Quran could speak of various true spiritual traditions in part because Arabic had borrowed from Persian a term for a religion, which could be used to refer to one valid faith among others. Greek-speaking Christians in that era did have ways of talking about the religions, but these terms were either vague piety or worship or invidious heresy and impiety. By referring to a set of equally valid spiritual paths with this term, the Quran was one of the first texts explicitly to imagine the category of multiple peer world religions. 46. The tradition remembered Muhammad treating equitably groups such as Christians who declined to convert. Ibn Hisham speaks of Arab Christians who came to Muhammad sometime in the 620s and engaged him in debate. 47. We can imagine dozens of these followers of Christ bedizened in fine kaftans after the way of Banu al-Harith of the Kalb tribe, coming in a procession to the messenger's mosque as he prayed the afternoon prayer, the silver crosses about the necks coruscating in the fiery sun. They would have entered the sturdy coral stone building and been shown to the cool interior courtyard that sheltered worshippers from Arabia's searing gales. Abd al-Masih, a deacon, and al-Aham, a priest, Saturday and discussed religion with Muhammad. Ibn Hisham wrote, when the two divines spoke to him, the apostle said to them, submit yourselves. They said, we have submitted. He rejected this assertion, saying that they maintained that God has a son. They said, but who is his father, Muhammad? The messenger was silent and did not answer them. The priests put the prophet in a difficult situation with the clever question. The Quran denies the fatherhood of God but affirms the virgin birth of Jesus. They are reported to have played on this potential contradiction. The answer, of course, is that the Quran views God not as anyone's father but as everyone's creator, including Jesus. He says, B. And it is Quran 3:47. The Christians consulted among one another. Did they argue and gesticulate as they Saturday on the mosque's soft imported carpets, jerking the loose sleeves of their umber robes? In the end, they decided to reject Muhammad's claim to prophethood. He allegedly offered to resolve the conflict by engaging in a ceremony of mutual imprecations where the two parties sit and ask God to strike down the false 1.48. The deacon, Abd al-Masih, cautioned the Christians against this proceeding, with Ibn Hisham implying he feared they would lose the contest. He addressed his flock, but if you decide to adhere to your religion and maintain your doctrine about your master, then take your leave of the man and go home. The Spider 29:46 says, debate the scriptural communities only in the best of ways, except for those who do wrong. Say, we believe in the revelation sent down to us, and the revelation sent down to you, our God and your God is one, and to him we have submitted. The verse suggests that Muhammad often engaged in polite exchanges with members of other communities. The Quran views a rejection of the new message as regrettable but continues to insist on Christians' eligibility for salvation. The scripture depicts God as promising Jesus about future Christians in the family of Amram 3:55. I will render those who follow you superior to the pagans until the judgment day. There will always be, the Quran vowed, a difference between followers of Jesus and the damned. The early 7th century was not known for religious tolerance. Most religious groups held that outsiders were doomed to hell. Zoroastrians, for instance, called their rite the good religion and referred to followers of other traditions as people of bad religion. A late Sasanian text tells the story of the Zoroastrian seeker Danag. He asks, bewildered, since it is known that the divine religion is true, why are there so many doctrines, beliefs and cosmic principles among the people? 49. As for Christianity, one 7th century Roman text aimed at converting Jews warns that on Jesus' second coming, those who had declined to believe in him will be delivered into eternal condemnation. From the 3rd century, influential Christian theologians such as Origen had begun putting forward the exclusivist precept that outside the church there is no salvation, and Christians widely adopted it. 50. Some Christians did advocate forms of inclusivism, holding that they had the whole truth but that others might have possessed part of it. The early Christian thinker Justin Martyr took a somewhat inclusivist position in replying to pagans who berated Christians as cruel for condemning to hell all human beings born before Jesus of Nazareth. Justin Martyr wrote that Christ is the Word or Logos, the principle of universal reason, of whom every race of men were partakers, and those who lived reasonably are Christians. They included ancient Greek philosophers such as Socrates as well as the patriarch Abraham. When Jesus was sent, he held those who rejected him could no longer be saved by the general principle of universal reason. 51. The exclusivist doctrines of salvation asserted by the Jews and Christians he knew distressed Muhammad. The Cow 2:111-112 says they maintain that no one will enter heaven but Jews or Christians. Such are their vain notions. Say, produce your proof, if you speak truly. Rather, all those who submit to God and do good works will receive their recompense with their Lord, and no fear will be upon them, nor will they sorrow. It denounces exclusivism as a vain notion, and makes universal criteria such as acceptance of the one God and good deeds the grounds for deliverance. Later in the Cow 2:135, the Quran complains, they say, become Jews and Christians and be guided. No, the philosophy of Abraham, the pious Gentile. He was no polytheist. Muhammad insisted on a pluralism centered on Abraham. The Quran, like the Epistle of James in the New Testament, sees salvation as dependent on both faith and works and, like James, sees Abraham as the paragon of both. James 2:14-26.52. The scripture, the Cow 2:138 goes on to compare following this philosophy of Abraham with being dyed by God in divine colors, take on the dye of God, and what dye is better than that of God? This metaphor also occurs in Greek philosophy. Plato in the Republic compares the training of youth in virtues to dyeing wool with fast colors. 53. Justin Martyr held that living in accordance with the pre-existent word of Jesus saved ancient Greek philosophers and patriarchs such as Abraham. The Jewish thinker Philo of Alexandria d. ca. 50 CE, however, portrayed Abraham as bearing such a word or reasoned discourse, bestowed by God, inasmuch as he exemplified piety and monotheism, the two paramount virtues. 54. The Quran concurs and goes on to say that living in accord with the monotheistic philosophy of Abraham suffices for salvation. It has been pointed out that Abraham is here a universal figure, not only the founder of the Kaaba, and his philosophy or word is an interpretive process, not a finished product. Another scholar observes that the philosophy of Abraham is in the singular, showing that the Quran views it as one encompassing tradition. Judaism, Christianity, and the faith of Muhammad, and any other monotheistic belief, are all Platonic forms of this transcendent word. Unlike the Gospel of John 8:31-59, and Christian writers such as Justin Martyr, the Quran includes Jews in Abrahamic universalism rather than using it to exclude them. 55. Muhammad taught that each faith community takes on two covenantal obligations. One relates to its own messenger. The Quran sees faithfulness to that specific dispensation as sufficient for salvation. The table 544 depicts God as saying, "We, in truth, revealed the Torah, in which is guidance and light." It is important that the Quran uses the present tense. The Hebrew Bible, the work of the same God as spoke to Muhammad, still contains guidance and light. The Quran laments, as does the Bible, that some Jews were not always faithful to the Mosaic commandments, as when they turned to worshipping the golden calf or when they grew weary of eating manna as they wandered in the wilderness and violated the Sabbath to bring home other food. 56. The exemplary character of the chosen people was not, however, lost as a result of these momentary lapses. The Heights 7:159 insists, among the people of Moses is a nation that guides others by the truth and establishes justice. Then the table 546 talks of the dispensation after the Jews, and we sent, following in their footsteps, Jesus the son of Mary, in confirmation of what was in the Torah, and we bestowed upon him the gospel, in which is guidance and light, in verification of the Torah and as direction and admonition for the God-fearing. In addition to the specific historical covenant of each religious community, the family of Amram 381 describes a moment when pre-existent souls concluded a general pact with the divine. In the Hebrew Bible, scholars have pointed out, the covenant is made in historical time and binds descendants of the patriarchs. New Testament authors viewed the covenant as universal, contracted with all humankind. The Quran describes God as calling all future humans together and asking them if they would accept each new messenger that God sent. These unborn generations agreed, saying, "We affirm it." 57. To renege on the universal pledge made before time to recognize all new messengers as they arrive is a moral shortcoming. 382. This doctrine of the covenant of the prophets is not pluralist but inclusivist. When Jews declined to accept Jesus or Christians refused to acknowledge Muhammad, they contravened this commitment. The scripture implies that while this violation puts them in the wrong, and even involves a minor form of paganizing, it is not a mortal sin of the sort that might exclude them from salvation, assuming they live a righteous life in the framework of their own tradition. The family of Amram 3:113 declares that each of the religions contains persons of higher and lower ethical values. It says they are not all the same. Some among the scriptural communities are an upstanding nation, who recite God's verses in the watches of the night while bowing in prayer. These Jews and Christians demonstrate the goodness not only by extra nighttime prayers but also by charity toward others and by believing in God and the resurrection day. The passage concludes 3:115, whatever philanthropy they do, God will not blot it out. 58. It has been shown that the earliest known author of a commentary on the Quran, Mujahid ibn Jabra, 642-722, explains that the meaning of the upstanding community here is any just community, by which he clearly meant to indicate that the Quran is speaking in general terms rather than specifying Muhammad's believers. 59. The family of Amram 3:64 calls for unity among the Hehazi monotheists, say, "People of the book, come to a common word between you and us, that we will only worship God and not associate anything with him, and that we will not take some of us as lords for others apart from God. If they turn away, say, bear witness that we are monotheists." The later commentator Tabari interpreted the passage as advocating a tolerant universalism, reading the last phrase as saying that if Jews and Christians did not wish to embrace Muhammad's new religion, it was enough for them to acknowledge that the believers were monotheists. 60. The Quran's broad vision of salvation was not unprecedented in late antiquity, though few groups went as far as it did. The rabbis who authored the Babylonian Talmud adopted the inclusivist position that non-Jews can have a portion in paradise if they abide by the 7 laws of Noah intended for all humankind, while Jews have an obligation of adhering to 613 laws or good deeds. 61. This Jewish stance of salvational inclusivism overlaps with but differs in some details from the Quranic doctrine. Both forbid adultery, murder, theft, and consuming blood. The Quran insists on a positive belief in the one God and in the resurrection day as basic requirements even for other religious communities. Still, Muhammad's moral laws are more complex than the 7 Noahide laws. It has been argued that there are passages of the Quran where something close to the 10 commandments given to Moses are required of the believers. 62. The epic emigration, despite the severe dangers attending it, is identified with the peace, sakina, that derives from the calming presence of God. On establishing the Medinan community of believers, the Quran 2:208 instructs them, "You who have believed, enter into peace altogether." In transforming Medina into a sanctuary city, Muhammad was creating a penumbra of tranquility there, mirroring the one that had governed Mecca and attempting to forestall any further civil wars such as the Battle of Bu-at. The Quran 3:103 says that Muhammad adopted the role in Medina of peacebuilder, uniting the hearts of former foes among the feuding clans of that city. The Quran embraces pluralism on the level of salvation but inclusivism at the level of theology. It allows that members of other faith communities can reach heaven. At the same time, it sees the older religions as somewhat corrupted by ideas and practices introduced over time that departed from the pure, exemplary faith of Abraham, and it does not hesitate to reproach him for these lapses. Still, God will forgive everything but outright polytheism. Religions have to be looked at both with regard to their insistence on right doctrine and with regard to the breadth of their notion of salvation. 63. Each dimension can be categorized as pluralist, inclusivist, or exclusivist. Roman Christianity of this period was exclusivist in both columns, insisting on the Chalcedonian Creed as the only true doctrine and on members of the Church as the only group saved from damnation. In contrast, the Quran is inclusivist with regard to doctrine. It maintains that its monotheistic canons are superior to those of contemporary Jews and Christians, who nevertheless have a large portion of the truth, and pluralist with regard to salvation. It asserts that monotheists will enter the garden after death regardless of lapses of dogma. In its version of pluralism, the Quran makes the logos of Abraham do the work done for broad-minded rabbis by the 7 laws of Noah. The Quran implies that members of other faiths might be granted a doctrinally less strict path to redemption, dependent on divine mercy, than is required of Muhammad's believers. Neither the Talmudic scholars who upheld the Noahide theory of salvation for Gentiles nor the Quran approved of Christian Trinitarianism, but neither one gave any signs of excluding Christians from having a portion of heaven. 64. The Quran sought to play down creedal formulas in favor of a political community of vaguely defined monotheists who could confront external attacks together. Attaining a state of ecumenical harmony inside the city would prove a nearly insuperable task. But the even more portentous challenge would come from the militant pagans of Mecca, who were plotting to conquer Medina, to extinguish the threat they saw in Muhammad and his embryonic faith, and perhaps to align the Hejaz unanimously with the ambitions of the Iranian King of Kings.